Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name's Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and I've been thinking a lot lately about The Dark Tower. So The Dark Tower is a fantasy series written by Stephen King, and I read the majority of it this summer. It completely consumed my life, and now that I've started The Wheel of Time, it made me sort of stop and reflect on The Dark Tower being the other big fantasy series I was reading this year other than the Dresden Files, which I'm still working on. It's a series that I really loved, but I've been reading so much and just flying through books this year that I haven't really had that moment to just stop and reflect on the books that I have been reading and enjoyed a lot. I feel like I'm always looking towards the next book and what's coming next instead of just reflecting and thinking more critically and deep about the books that I actually enjoyed. But I wanted to show some more love to this series, and that's why I'm talking about it today. Coming up with this order was really tough, tougher than I thought initially. And now that I'm about to actually go through with it and rank these books, I'm starting to rethink some of my placements, but I just want to get started and say my rankings before I change my mind for the 50th time. I really like all these books, and I just want to get that clear before I start putting them in a list. There's no book in this series that I don't like. If you think that just because one of these books is at the bottom of the list, that doesn't mean I didn't like it. I know there's going to be maybe some controversial opinions on this list, some books that people are more mixed on that I was more positive on, and vice versa. And quickly, before I get started, I just wanted to mention that there will be some light, very mild spoilers. I'm not going to say anything that will ruin your experience of reading it or take away from it, but in order to give context for some of these books, explain what they were about or what they meant to me, I'm going to have to touch on a little bit just to give you a frame of reference for what I'm talking about. So let's get started with the list. So at the bottom of the list, and remember, that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy this one. I really did enjoy this book, but at number 8 at the very bottom is The Wind Through the Keyhole. So this was a book that was written after the series proper ended. A few years later, Stephen King came back and wrote another story in the Dark Tower universe. And it takes place between books 4 and 5. And Stephen King even says that you could read it between book 4 and 5, but I disagree with that. There's a lot that's in this book that makes more sense in the context of having read the final 3 in the series. But overall, I like this book. It was nice to return to the characters in the series as they were between books 4 and 5. A lot happens in books 5 to 7, so to go back to where they were at this time was a little refreshing and felt like catching up with some old friends that you hadn't seen in a while. So this book had a unique structure to it. It started with a framing story that was the main characters from the series, and in that role, the main character told a story of his youth, and it was when he was trying to catch this monster, and it had a very almost murder mystery detective vibe to it. But within that story, there was another story of him telling a fairy tale to a younger kid, and that takes up about half of this book, and the name of that fairy tale is The Wind Through the Keyhole, where the title of this book comes from. It was a pretty low stakes and not the most crazy or inventive or out there of this series, but I thought it was really enjoyable, really fun. It was light and breezy, and overall I just enjoyed being in that world again after the craziness of the final 3 books, and especially to revisit the characters as they were in that point in time. And I thought the fairy tale itself was actually a really good story. It was put well together, it had very empathetic characters, and some antagonists that were maybe similar to some antagonists from the actual series that Roland and the quartet had to deal with. The story in which he's trying to solve the murders with the monster that is around the fairy tale wasn't the greatest, although I do love that kind of story setup, but I feel like that one wasn't as fleshed out as the fairy tale within. So next on the list, we have The Song of Susannah, book 6 in the series. So this is a book, again, that I really did like, but ultimately, to me, feels the most forgettable. And not in that the things that happen in it aren't important or aren't good or well done. It's that the structure of this is really strange and interesting. It's this middle ground that really relies on the setup from book 5 and book 7, 2 much bigger and fleshed out books, and feels kind of more of a bridging story between the two than its own story in its own right. There are some days where I think this story could have been reworked into books 5 and 7 somehow, but I couldn't really see how to do that. So I guess it makes sense that Stephen King did it in this way, but it was really strange coming from the big epic story of 5 and then following with the big, even more epic story of book 7, having this little tiny bridge story in between that I finished, I think, in 2 days. But other than that strange placement of the book, I gotta say I really did enjoy it, and I was so eager to get into book 7 after it because it promised a lot of big things to come. So next on the list we have The Wastelands, book 3 in the series. This is the most, I guess, middle of the pack book that I could think of. It had a lot of cool stuff in it, but ultimately wasn't the most memorable or the most important book in the series. It was fun, it was exciting, but it feels like almost 2 books in one, where there was a lot of different things happening in the first versus kind of the arc of the second. And what I enjoyed about this book is that it set up a lot of the world for the following books to come. It really got you to understand more of Midworld and what was the scope of things there. And it's in this book where we finally have our assembly of the team, the unit, the quartet. The characters that the series had been setting up until that point are finally met in this one, and from there on it becomes a different trajectory for the characters. There were a couple memorable moments in me for this one, and I felt like the characters did a lot of cool and interesting stuff, but in comparison to the rest of the series, it wasn't the most memorable or the most cool things that those characters ended up doing. It was just sort of middle of the pack. Still good, still a good time, still a great Dark Tower story, but ultimately just not my favorite. Alright, next on the list we have The Gunslinger, the first book in the series. So my history with The Gunslinger is a bit different than that of the rest of the series. I actually found this copy, this used copy here of The Gunslinger, maybe I think 6 years ago at this point, in a comic book store of all places, and I was just getting into King at the time. I think I had read Salem's Lot and The Shining up until then, and then when I learned Stephen King had a fantasy series, I was like, okay, awesome, great, I really want to get into this. So I read The Gunslinger, I loved it, I immediately picked up the drawing of the 3, read the first third of it, I think, and then for some reason or another, I think I was just because a new semester of school was starting, I didn't continue it. But I still wanted to continue the series, so they sat on my bookshelf for years until last summer when I said, okay, now's the time, I'm gonna get into the Dark Tower again. So I reread The Gunslinger because it had been a number of years, and as soon as I got to drawing of the 3 again, I stopped. This time for no reason in particular. And then coming to this summer, I think it was May or June, I said, you know what, I'm just gonna skip The Gunslinger, I've read it twice already, I don't need to read it again, I'm just gonna go into drawing of the 3 and continue on from there. And then finally, having done that, I finished the remainder of the series. But in finishing all the books, after Went Through the Keyhole, I went back and listened to the audiobook of The Gunslinger because I just needed to go back to the beginning and listen to where it all started one last time. So at this point, I've read The Gunslinger 3 times, but the rest of the series only once. But it's very unique, very atmospheric, and it sets up this world which is so moody and mysterious that hooked me right away and made me want to continue reading the rest of the series. And a lot of people say out there, maybe skip The Gunslinger if you're coming into this series new and you're not into that sort of thing, but I would recommend reading it anyway. I'm a fan of westerns in movies, and I thought that this book did a really good job of giving you that brooding, dread atmosphere that a lot of westerns have, mixed with setting up this really fantastical world that had a lot of great mysteries and questions I wanted answered, and a very stoic but alluring protagonist that I ended up following through the rest of the series and being one of my favorite characters in it. And one of my favorite characters of all time, honestly. So The Gunslinger I have at this point in the list, more so because of my history with it and its status and what it set up, rather than maybe its own merits as a book. Next up, we have Wolves of the Calla, book 5. This was a really cool book. I enjoyed this one from start to finish. It was a lot coming off of Wizard and Glass, which was the biggest book in the series up until that point. And to come into this with sort of a similar Western arc, book 4 had a lot of Western tropes to it. And then to come into book 5, which borrows a lot from the Magnificent Seven or Seven Samurai, depending on which one you want to consider. It felt like 2 Western stories back to back, but it did it enough in a different way that each book felt unique. And I thought the setup and hook of this one was really cool. Seven Samurai is one of the best movies of all time, so I was absolutely drawn into that setup right from the get-go. I knew where it was going, and the fact that I think it had even a Magnificent Seven quote at the beginning of the book, I was just like, okay, this is going to be pretty cool. And book 5 is really important as well, because at this point in the series, Stephen King had gone through his accident and started recovering from it, and this was the first book to come out since then in the Dark Tower series. And in him going through that crisis, he realized that he didn't want to leave the Dark Tower series unfinished before he died, and having nearly nearly died, he felt that, okay, now is the time to wrap it all up. So he wrote the final 3 books in pretty quick succession within a couple of years, and this was the first one of those. So at this point, you can really feel the wheels turning for the end of the series to come. He starts setting up a lot of very crucial things in this book that paid off in books 6 and 7, but it still felt like it was its own story. It had its own arc, and things really were never the same from this point for the quartet. This book feels like it's the beginning of the 3rd act. There's stuff in here that's so important even until the last moments of the last book, and I absolutely love this one. And a lot of people say that the end of this book feels a little rushed or too quick, and I have to disagree with that, because I think something that Stephen King does in this series is having really clear intent. If something is rushed or fast or anticlimactic, he did that on purpose. There is a level of anticlimax in this series, and I'll get into this with some of the other books that are still to come, but he did that intentionally for a purpose. And while I may agree and enjoy or disagree with the way some of those things were handled, I can't say that Stephen King wasn't very clear with his intent, and I think that in the way this climax was handled was very intentional. And this book also contained one of the best character backstories in the series. I think if you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about. There's a character that they meet in Calla Sturgis, which is the town in here, that may be familiar to some Stephen King readers, but they have a very interesting backstories on how they arrived into this town. And that was probably the best part of the book for me, and Stephen King just excels at that so much. Maybe it's because of his extensive experience writing short stories, but I think that when he gets into a little sequence or an aside or a backstory, he's really good at fleshing that stuff out. So now we get into the top 3 of my list, and by factor of subtraction, you can kind of guess what 3 books are left. And book 3 might be controversial for some. I know a lot of people really don't like this book, but I like this book a lot. Thought it was very thematically cohesive, and the ending was perfect, and that's book 7, The Dark Tower. I thought it was the perfect end to the series. It wasn't a perfect book. I mean, there's some things in there that just didn't work as well for me, but I gotta say that the way it wrapped up for the characters was very well done, and there were moments in here that made me honestly tear up. Books don't make me get that emotional. It's hard for them to do that, but getting here and getting to some of the points in this book where you've come to the end of a journey and you're just, I don't know, this book just did it so well, where it felt so bittersweet, where there were some good endings, some bad endings for characters, some anticlimactic endings, like I mentioned before, where there had been plot threads that had been woven through 3 or 4 books leading up to this that just kind of ended. And to me, that stuff feels intentional, but at the same time, the question is raised, why? Why were some of these things left so anticlimactic or so unfulfilled? But the ending, if you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about, was absolutely thematically perfect to me, and a perfect ending for what the series had been setting up until that point. And I can see why people would be upset by that, but for me, it worked completely. Going on that final journey with some of these characters for I think the 2-ish weeks it took me to finish this was something that I'll never forget. And there was a concept that was raised, I think it was in this book, called kashum, which is that feeling of something that's fleeting and about to end soon. You know, that feeling you get in the last week of school or before you're gonna leave and start a new chapter in your life. That feeling was really strong here, and that was something even reflected in the text of the book. And at number 2, we have book 2, The Drawing of the Three. So like I mentioned earlier, this is a book that I started around 6 years ago, and I read the first third of, and I really liked it. I thought it was very different from what book 1 had set up. Thematically, tonally, character-wise, things were just different. And in having gotten back to it this year, I can say that this book was just totally whack, totally crazy. I thought The Gunslinger was weird and crazy, but this book was like a roller coaster, just from start to finish. Absolute madness, and it was so good. It's almost a perfect book to me. We really get to start understanding the characters a bit more here, and characters who are very important to the rest of the series are first introduced in this one, albeit very different from how they end up later in the series. But Stephen King did such a good job of really hooking you into the series at this point, and I guess that's why I can see some people recommend starting with book 2. I still disagree, but I absolutely love this book, and it combines so many different genres. Book 1 was a blend of Western and fantasy. This one has Western, fantasy, crime, psychological thriller, historical fiction. It's just all over the board, and it sounds so whack and so much like a mess, but it totally works. And it's also one of the shorter books in the series that I just burned through because the pacing was so fast. Crazy stuff was just happening right off the bat. And it was at the ending of this book, I was coming to the last couple pages and I thought to myself, wow, this is really something special. More than The Gunslinger, more than what I had read 5 years ago, this book really showed me how unique and special the Dark Tower series was going to be for me. So here we are. My favorite book in the series. This is another controversial opinion. I know a lot of people really don't like this one, and I can understand why, but the reasons why it didn't work for some people was why it worked for me. So my number one on the list, if you haven't guessed it already, is Wizard and Glass. This may be one of the best written books I've ever read in my life, let alone a Stephen King book. It is at this point my favorite Stephen King book, even outside of the Dark Tower, but this was just such a perfect book to me. Firstly, starting off with wrapping up the craziness and the way book 3 kind of left you hanging. This first act here, when you're with the main characters and how it wraps up that stuff from book 3. Like, just to start off on that was nuts. And the way it was wrapped up was so cool. And then for the story to kind of take a turn and go into a character's flashback and a backstory that lasts for maybe 90% of this entire book. There's very little of this book that actually deals with forwarding the story of the quartet and the journey to the Dark Tower, and it's mostly Roland's backstory. And I could see why that upsets a lot of people. It doesn't really forward the story too much, but there's so much here that's so important to understanding Roland and why he's going after the Dark Tower and why he is the way he is. And if you were reading these as the books were coming out, I understand why you wait for years for a book to come out, then it comes out and the story barely moves forward. Or if you weren't aware that it was mostly backstory, I was fortunate enough to know that this was mostly backstory, so I went into it aware of that and not gonna be upset by it because I already had that information, so I was prepared for it. Barring all that stuff aside and just taking it as its own book without any other outside stuff, it is such a perfect book. This story, Roland's flashback, and finding out why he is who he is was such a beautiful story. I'm not super into romances, but this has got to be one of the best romances ever written. It was just so beautiful, so elegant, and it leaned into a lot of the Western tropes, but mixed that with the other elements in a way where it felt very organic, even more so than The Gunslinger, and had such memorable characters and great moments taken straight out of Western movies. And I thought that story was so complete, so beautiful. And this was the book that really made me value Stephen King as a writer and not just the guy who writes scary books. His words here were so evocative. I thought the prose painted such a colorful picture in my mind of what was happening here and of the town of Hambury and all the characters and the factions and the geography of it. It was just all so well fleshed out and organic. So that's why Wizard and Glass, book 4 in the series, is my number 1. So that's it for my list. I know there maybe have been some controversial opinions on here, but if you agree with me, let me know. And if you don't, why don't you write your top 8 list in the comments as well. Let me know how you'd rank the books, because no matter who it is, every time I look up these lists online, they're different for everybody. People respond to these books so differently, and that's the great thing about these books, is that they're so unique and so different that everyone approaches them and takes something away that's different from the other people. Thinking about this series again just makes me want to reread them, honestly. I feel like I do have a reread in me someday, but for right now I'm going to focus on The Wheel of Time. I'm going to start book 2, The Great Hunt, I believe next week. I just finished Skin Game and I'm working on Briefcases, the second short story collection in the Dresden Files. So after that, I'm going to get into Wheel of Time, and that's probably going to consume my life next year. And maybe I'll do a ranked book list of that once I'm finished. But The Dark Tower has a special place in my heart, and I'd love to come back to it someday. So remember to do all the YouTube stuff before leaving, like liking and subscribing. Thank you to all the people who have been subscribing lately. It's gone up a lot, and I'm so grateful for your support. Thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.